Hello everyone, today we briefly, but probably not so briefly as always, talk about one topic came up recently in my mind after I was asked a question about I could have made it a question and answer video, but it's slightly different. Maybe we'll leave it for another time. It wasn't for, person asking me for a direct answer immediately, but whether history is really reliable. Right, I can't say the term is, it's about the veridicity rather of history, not quite the fact whether it was true, it was real, or but properly, how do we know that something in the past happened, right? And the question by itself, in fact, would require much, more powerful digression, properly on the historical method, and a lot of considerations, of course, on how we make history and how it's always been made, right? And how much we can understand, how much we can truly believe went on in the past, and therefore stick to it as an evidence of some sort. But this topic has many implications, including one that I've seen happening around often, that is sort of distrust, like the idea that fundamentally you have been lied to, right? That history is not really what you have been told, and things have always been different. And there are different grades, different levels of this legitimate distrust, because you should never kind of blindly believe anything. I believe that's a pretty sound moral principle, but also you shouldn't even fall in skepticism either, right? That is to say, at some point it seems that our civilization, our culture gets so frustrated with, let's say, in part the same lack of historical knowledge that it has by itself, on average, right? And the average person. But secondly, in fact, how these persons, it's as if they didn't have enough antibodies on their own when they don't know history. And this is true properly from a moral and scientific point of view. That is to say, literally, as Cicero said, not knowing history is fundamentally remaining a child forever, right? And this is real, right? That there is hardly a more powerful statement than that when it comes to describe the difference that it makes to be into history in a way or in another. That naturally there are different ways of being, and this distrust can go as far as properly also being quite vocal about it, given that I speak from the within towards scholarship. Right, that people say, but how can we trust historians? What are their interpretations? Here on Schwerpunkt, I don't get so many questions about my content. Well, okay, yes, I mean, it seems that you generally trust me for some reason. You may legitimately say, well, why, how is it this thing that we should take, right? Is it real? Where did you get this information from? Generally speaking, it seems that I believe that most of my audience is also aware of many historical realities, that I don't need to make some broader introduction, but sometimes also realize that I do tend to overestimate people's understanding of history, whoever they are in general. I would say including my own, at least in theory, because in practice I am a way, probably even overly confident person in terms of what I think I understand history like, that is not to properly know too much of it or being extremely, surgically precise, let's say, but properly to have a mindset and a frame and a certain moral background that brought me to look at history in a way that objectively I haven't seen quite in so many other people's with colleagues and professors and so on. I could make lots of videos about each and every one of these topics, and I think they would be really instructive. But what I wanted to discuss today is properly how far should we go with the distrust towards history. At times I made videos that were literally, I think one of the earliest ones were about, beware of historiography. It was titled like that or something like similar. And as you know, for the older date followers that if you have followed me regularly, you know that I've been mostly vocal against scholarship and historiography in general, right? But from the other side, I realized that, of course, by stating this, I somewhat I hope to have instilled at least some good, healthy skepticism, not the, some awareness at least of the fact that, history as it is presented to us through the media broadly meant, right, is obviously always fact mediated, in a political sense, as any kind of history. Even the history I make is politically mediated, even if I try not to be too harsh about it. And again, this is the distinction, right? Because if people initially, I think this happened with me too, that I believed there was also a time when I began Schwerpunkt in which I still believe this, that it is to say a historian that openly states that he's saying something political, like a journalist or anybody, it shouldn't quite be that, right? Should make an effort always to be objective. The concept here is that, yeah, I try to do that, but at the same time, there's not a single human being on earth that is not being political in any kind of statement he or she make, right? Even if they want Cheetos over, I don't know, pizza, they are expressing a political opinion, even if they don't realize it, for example. And so there is a distinction, whereas Aristotle would say, between what happens in power, let's say, and in act, right? Potential and in act, that is an important difference. And it's always this double thread that we have to be aware of, cognitively speaking, regarding the fact that there is something out there that is going on that we don't clearly understand, and that we will always understand in a faulty way, in fact, and ourselves, and so the way we decide to pose ourselves in front of this reality. So by saying that history altogether is kind of rigged by our misunderstanding shouldn't have anything to do with the distrust that we have towards history in general, right? I've met for a lot of people, for example, from, I don't know, post-socialist past, post-socialist background, that struck me, right? Because that tells you how things work in totalitarian regimes, and this is something, you can easily see even in, post-fascist countries like mine, or whenever you realize what controlling somebody's mind for what purpose, right, it's properly done, that the first thing they indoctrinated them to was not really thinking that there was a real history, right? That there was something like a crystalline, clear, and unconfutable reality that was, I don't know, the one of the regime and how the revolution, how it had risen to power and so on. But let's say mixing cards, let's say fueling mostly hatred, discrimination, and channeling therefore certain things towards a sort of real or fictitious or both at the same time enemy, and explaining how of course there was some historical reality to it, but this was somewhat to gain in a mostly as a negative reality. That is to say, they were in that condition, which of course was of appalling moral and material misery, because there was a gigantic effort that needed to be done to arrive to an end point where everything would have been clearer, and so we would have finally dominated the world, and from and our own historiography and reality would have triumphed. Because of course human brains do not quite are not really satisfied with things that do not make sense, right? But they can dramatically be taught and trained and curbed to accept that maybe something doesn't make sense at the moment, but there will be a time when it will, right? And this is especially true when you study realities where the main objective was just to survive, in a sense. And aside from all the paranoia, the distrust, the simple lack of education and intelligence that derive, of course, from these realities, what strikes you the most is how even in front of actual evidence and in front of a world that naturally has brought forward instead a very refined and and complex and developed historiography, still the distrust remains, right? And this is something that goes on basically in every community in a way or another. In Western Europe, it's also very marked still, and I think it has increased over time. It is, first of all, people at some point never got too much content of the fact that fascism ended at some point. There are so many people who are nostalgic of that in ways that are frankly disgusting, but they have nothing to do even with the reality, with actually knowing the reality of history per se, right? I think that being a Marxist or a communist is a declaration of complete moral, civil, intellectual, and educational inferiority, but the same it is true for ethno-nationalists and Nazi fascists and so on, simply because these were, appallingly stupid political doctrines with no real foundation. In fact, that, didn't actually have any sound cultural or historical educational background, and were just used to feed the alienated mobs of, in fact, radically undereducated and fundamentally stupid people, because otherwise they could have never gotten to power, right? That's the other myth, that any kind of dictatorship or totalitarian regime or authoritarian regime will tell about the people. It's essentially a populistic one, that is that the people are good people. Right, and all the faults are, one or another at the top, right? Whether they were thinking to do it for good or not, right? And so that there is this deep. This is the sap of such regimes, because that teaches essentially to deresponsibilize the individual from what is going on, right? You hand over everything to the regime, so they have to think for you, and in what actually happens at that point is you conferring to those people power, right? Power that technically could easily take back, because again, there is a bit this myth of tyranny, especially in a good half of Western culture, that is obsessed with the fact, again, it reinforces even part the stereotype that somewhat it's all the tyrant's fault, right? There is an evil guy at the top, and all the other poor people are just going to die for the love of the fatherland, right? It's they're just a bunch of fascist pigs that are, essentially killing people because somebody, because they're okay with that, right? And once they're armed, they could easily turn their rifle against those who armed them and not killing the innocents, or even whether they were fighting against another evil totalitarian regime, their civilizational capacity would have been enhanced by being, a democracy and having a healthy moral balance and force towards properly some scientifically orientable intelligence, right? And that's the reason why, I don't know, the Germans completely screwed up Operation Barbarossa, lost the Second World War completely on their own. Because when you talk about this, it's always the same thing. It's about, say, military incapacity derives from political incapacity, right? And there is not such a thing, and especially political incapacity, because the military is not really brought to think rationally, right? They just have to train to do something they're very good at. They have a taste for gamble, fundamentally, and of course it takes a lot of intelligence in the higher echelons, but it's not the prerogative of the army per se. It's the prerogative of politics to orient it, to employ the military instrument. This is von Clausewitz, right? Towards an end that makes sense, right? It's like the Schlieffen Plan, right? In 1914, the Germans again screwed up. These are the greatest, essentially, military disasters in the history of mankind. They could have still, at that point, by 1914, achieved, a shameful but still contained peace with France, and avoided millions of dead, including most of which from their own country, up to for other 4 years, right? Instead, they went on with this lunacy for so long that, of course, at some point there were some capacities to breach, right, to break through, etc. But what they had politically hoped for, that is to knock out France, and so the Entente in a single blow failed, and the Entente kept holding, and so the thing didn't collapse, and they collapsed instead. And National Socialism actually has a great deal to do also with that disaster, because if you want even to blame, I don't know, the French or the winners of World War I in the first place for having eventually imposed harsh conditions on Germany. Well, the point is that Germany should have not put itself in that condition in the first place. But of course, there were also a lot of broader or shared responsibility that this have absolutely, however, nothing to do with the fact that still individual responsibilities are true in absolute terms. So that cannot be erased, and that's something that historically, in fact, by regimes was used to erase this thing. It's like, the idea, during World War II, we were fighting against Bolshevism, we were fighting against the communistization of Europe. Yeah, that is true, but this has nothing to do with the fact that you still were, a regime that, took out with industrial efficiency 10 millions of people, and also screwed up completely, the Eastern Front, not just for the complete miscalculation and misassessment of enemy forces, but also because you alienated the sympathies of other tens of millions of people that, you were at that point entering in the land of, and they were hoping to be liberated from communism, and instead you were just saying, well, just wait, the war ends, but we have to take you out because you belong to an inferior race, and we are, using now just for the sake of labor force, military capacity, because, that's our Lebensraum, right? So these are the levels of historical interpretation that usually people do not really like to talk about, because that's why history is political, because everything that is told usually for reasons that have nothing to do with a purely scientific understanding of human reality. They have to do just with my own thing, right? It's an endless historical narcissism about, it's the same thing that, woke policy is doing now, right? That's why there is no effectively any single kind of difference between fascism and that, right? It's racist, it's fascist, it's completely out of of reason, of the dignity of human goodness. It's simply a complete disaster that mirrors the failure, in fact, of the moral and intellectual and educational capacity of an entire civilization, right? These are not, let's say, just woke people. These are people that came from a past that was not able to provide them with a human intelligence worth of this name, and you have to reach the root of that, right? It's not just simply a contingent thing. There is always something that goes beyond, and this is why history is so rich in let's say in twists, if you want, in surprises for the average person, because of course there is so much to learn that it never ends, right? So that can be interpreted paranoidly in exactly in this sense. It is to say, the more you don't know, the more you fear. This is a normal cognitive let's say reality, not even a problem, because it's how we came out from evolution, right? There is no way we can do about that if not educating ourselves, so informing ourselves and being ever more fit to cope with with the reality of the world. So the question here is not just about teaching people not to distrust history per se, but it's properly trying to unchain them, to unhinge them, to take them away in a way or another from these prejudices that the same Enlightenment in the positive part of it said are essentially prejudices that are built by yourself. They're not born out because because a normal human being is a brave, good, beautiful, special person. Right, the average human being is simply disgusting. Right, we confer it a standard level of dignity. We have some political and communitary and reasons for developing a moral system where everybody is provided with the possibility, with the chance, with the right to be free, to live a fulfilling life, and so on. But this has nothing to do with the fact that the overwhelming majority of the population completely runs short of any kind of decent expectation, right? And that we have to cope with it collectively because we have to pay for the failure of these persons. One point of history is, of course, that as long as this is not just about educating people about history, right? Which would be a matter of, it would be a kind of social engineering, right? You would expect from a civilization that people to be able to educate themselves by themselves, but this is evidently not true, and human nature is lazy, is weak, is cowardly, right? Humans are cowards. Let's be honest about this. They just fear. They tend to remain where they are if you don't stimulate them, right? Or at least they could grow, but let's say if there is not an environment that pressures them, they will not be quite able to do it too. So that's why we mandated mass education, schooling, and so on, because otherwise, in the world growing and with all the challenges posed by that, it was understood, right? And this was just a few hundred years ago, that we needed to force people to be educated, right? Which requires, first of all, a coercion, a discipline, an authority. So those are also things that without which a civilization cannot exist by definition. And the reason why in the world somebody came first and others came later was fundamentally revolving about this crucial political cohesion that reflects a moral force, capacity that was the one to understand where we are going to when we want to achieve something. So history shouldn't be seen as a passive, mandatory story that you're fed when you're in school, because schools at this point suck, right? And it's not even about the fact, as they would like to make you believe, that schools are still the old way. Schools have already been reformed, right? It's just that the reform has been worse than, brought to the complete collapse of scientific quality and standards, right? That is, kids are ever more stupid, are ever less educated, but because the teachers are ever more stupid and ever less educated. I can confidently say, for whatever I've seen all over the Western world, that I hope, I'm sure there are some teachers here among you. I think that, as always, most human groups suck, but yes, teachers altogether do suck, right? As history professors, university professors altogether, scientists, whoever, objectively on average, they suck, right? And there are reasons why we can't digress on. We were being vocal about this, so it's obvious that in this reality, you cannot expect from persons to be to be intelligent if the same people who are supposed to provide that intelligence are not intelligent themselves. And believe me, it's a very serious. I think I would start to make a series of all the things I come across every day at this point, of people my age or younger or older that I encounter and that tell me what their motivation for which, for example, they don't give a shit about learning. Way or another, explicitly or implicitly, and it comes out the truth, right? When they went to school, teachers were incapable morons that were not even, able of stimulating a critical thought on the basis of a scientific evidence, who were not able to provide authority or discipline, or who didn't have intellectual standards, who were there just not for teaching kids, but to get money, and that they were done for. I could speak of my school experience myself. The point, though, is that there is also kind of a moral individual responsibility that is effectively what lacks if you don't have such kind of motivation. By that point, the families should be the ones to provide such thing, and a school cannot fix family, because family is overwhelmingly more important than school. Right, and in fact, not surprisingly, woke policy at this point is essentially blackmailing and threatening and silencing and discriminating and abusing and terrorizing, trying to essentially cut completely off parents from the education of children. And this is yet another dramatic civilizational collapse, which is the teacher's fault, but these teachers are children of somebody else, right? And the reason why they came out as this, abortive nature is that, from a mental point of view, is that they had parents that sucked, right? And that's the other truth of the story, because children are the single most precious resource that we have in the world, right? Their brains are there to be children and kids right? Especially it's crucial the age, the first adolescence, like the middle school. Those are years when you learn something, that those brains are like sponges, are going to be molded literally in what they are going to be able to perform later, right? Most of the high school years, like, kids are already old, right? They mostly built up certain things that they will remember, but if they haven't learned the essentials, the basics, when they were younger, and when they were in elementary school, they hadn't yet learned how to behave, or even before, because neuropsychology tells us that happens between 3 or 4 years old. If you're by 3 or 4 years old, you don't know how to behave. Basically, it turns out you're screwed up as an individual. I mean, all the frustrated persons today that you see that are impolite, rude, stupid, uncivilized, envious, hateful, and so on. They're just essentially the product of a parental failure in the first years of their life, right? Because parents were not there to discipline them. They left them like goats roaming around and not giving a damn about their own moral standard, because they didn't have moral standards themselves, right? Ever since I can remember as a kid, right? I had, my peers around me, to me, they were wild animals, right? I didn't know how to say that, right? Some of them were nice kids, but they were nice kids only when they had nice families, right? The others were just like literally animals. Like, I always disliked them, and the great part of this need for discipline and authority and training and, essentially not giving a damn about a person feeling in front of reality for what it is, stems exactly from the sense of injustice that I've always instinctively felt. Right, maybe my parents also, gave me that idea, because they were surely people who were in control of themselves, who wouldn't let me do certain things, because they knew that it was important for me to come up as a balanced individual, and I hope I've been, because even if, when all the things, very strange life that I have, statistically, in terms of, how we can lead it this way, I've never had, like, mental problem of any kind, never had fundamentally a breakdown, a moment in which I lost touch with the reality with myself, right? That's something that I think, as a historian, was crucial for me, because I've never searched for my moral barycenter outside of me, right? Ever since I was a child, I wanted to know answers based on factual reality, not what the adult told me, or just what the book said, which I was able to understand. That wasn't the full explanation. I wanted to literally know how things worked, how mechanics worked, how the world went on. And of course, kids. But it's important to be set on the right track since the beginning. And this maybe is just the balance I personally had. I don't know. There are people who, I'm not blaming people who had disadvantaged situations per se, but there is always this idea that it doesn't matter how much the world crushed you, the point is that you still have your own moral responsibility, and you cannot do without that. So towards history, you should pose always yourself like that, because as we have always explained, history is not a story, it's not a narrative, right? And this is instead how it's being treated politically up to this point. In a way, let's say there was some happy moment in Western culture, that essentially up to, in fact, the beginning of the third millennium, that where we got some standards that, albeit popular culture still always sucked, and because there was never a happy historical moment completely so, but still set us on the track to say something should be demonstrated scientifically, should be a debate on it, and there's nothing is off the table, and that we should always be extremely responsible about what this thing concretely is going to be, and not just because we have to, in fact, perscrutate the skies and to wait for an answer, but because we must have very clearly in mind what we're asking that for in the first place, because we must be motivated by something. The same with history, because history is an inquiry, right? It's not a narrative, it's not a story, it's not what your cousin told you, or what what you heard somewhere, what you read on Facebook or on Twitter. It's factually what you go searching for yourself, right? And this, it's exactly this process that distinguishes, also professionally, in theory, by the way, because it's not always the same. Such standards are collapsing. The historian, but it's an existential philosophical point from who simply doesn't give a damn, right? If you meet a person who says, I don't give a damn about history, you know that you're dealing with a moron. Because it's not a matter of saying, I don't know history, or I know a few of it. It is literally, if you don't feel the need to know it, you are a moron, right? I've met a lot of plainly ignorant individuals that, however, were, good persons in media, because every time they were exposed with some new information, they were quite interested in it, right? They may have, you cannot, I can't be a hypocrite in this sense. Of course, the two things overlap, but not completely, right? There are people who are capable of accepting the fact that if somebody has the tools, and they are fundamentally scientific tools, because you have to explain in a way or another, you have to provide with a method, with an evidence. It's not just about, in fact, the narrative, right? And people instead are, caught by the narrative, and it's very easy for a completely ignorant person to be caught by the narrative before the method, the demonstration, because it's quicker. It's not even always true in this way, meaning that maybe we accept these narratives, right? In the fact that, if you have 20 years old, I mean, at this point, you don't even remember a world without smartphones, right? So in that reality, in the way information was delivered, in the way properly the media used to communicate, right? The criticism, the need for research, or the need for an objective reliability went out of the window, right? And we can hardly deny that. And we are assisting to a situation where, as always, it's not really the evil guys' fault that want to exploit the pure, innocent young people. It's the young people who are a bunch of imbeciles, and that fundamentally are going to pay to be exploited on purpose, and that therefore handing over, concrete power to other people. You would say, you're speaking on YouTube. Well, yeah, okay, I do, right? I know what YouTube does, and I know what the world problem is, but at the same time, I kind of made a sort of of calculation for which I think I may still be wrong, but that is still better than other means that I can't find at the moment. But it can be enough to instill some kind of awareness at some levels. I know I sound quite arrogant, and frankly, I tell you this, that I like to be peremptory, right? I don't like to be apodictic, because otherwise I would deny all what I'm saying here, but I like to be peremptory, because it is a matter of moral force first and foremost. That is to say, if you're not motivated to die literally for these ideas, you can't quite be reliable, right? Somebody can listen to this stuff for whichever reason, because here made this history videos somebody likes, and they come across this one, but concretely, this is the broader motivation. Why do you think that I'm re-uploading all these videos now? It's gonna take forever, like it's killing me in process, and it's terrible, right? But because I have this motivation, and this motivation is not imposed on me by something or somebody else, or at least I am the first mover of this, right? Because if it wasn't for me, like, this thing would have not been properly even there was somebody there, if they clicked and followed and listened, had was interested in it, was allowing to invest his or her own time in such in listening to such things. And that's important, because you can't be tricked by that, right? If nobody had been interested, I give you that it's not a particularly successful channel, but it, at the same time, was growing before I cut my own legs with this copyright thing now, and I'm but it will keep rising again. It's just that I have this transitional phase. I have to re-upload all the stuff, right? It's not pleasant, but I hope, at least from your side, not much changed. So history, why should you distrust history, right? History is a method. So if you distrust history per se, you distrust fundamentally scientific method, right? And you all immediately understand that this cannot be the case. When I encounter people that fundamentally don't accept that this is an important or interesting thing to learn, I know that there is a lack there of awareness that stands. You see, I talk with people that also have other professions, right? I am not saying that history is the all healer, but we could really be here, because the average person, even when, I don't know, I've talked to engineers, right? And maybe, okay, they were engineers maybe from certain parts of the world, from a certain background, maybe they weren't simply great people, because, on average, I don't think any profession is a great people, not even historians, right? It's just who they are and what they do that makes the thing. But let's say you're talking to persons that in theory should have, again, that hopeful education, if anything, to know how to build a house or bridge, right, in this specific case. And when you realize that, they reject even the idea with hostility, right? It is to say, I don't know if you've ever talked about philosophy with somebody and never met somebody who says, philosophy sucks. Right, there is this idiosyncrasies that I understand, because I also don't particularly like philosophy, but I don't particularly like it because I know that most people who engage in it usually are in a certain way that I don't like. But I could never say I don't need to learn philosophy, because factually that's one of the single most important things that I learned, also from an historical and scientific and moral point of view. I couldn't do without that. Right, and this has nothing to do even with believing in that, but most people don't even care. It's like with religion. Why is that theophobia is so widespread? There are historical reasons to that. There was a moment of oppression of societies that were, communities were, emerging from a certain reality that, of course, took its own time to change mindset, to change back, to change culture. So many people actually today are not just, okay, I'll do without religion, and that's it. No, they hate religion. They want to prevent others not to study religion, right? I've met educators who say basically religion shouldn't be taught to people because it's dangerous. How can you be a healthy, mature individual with a civil right, I don't know, to vote and state something like that? You shouldn't basically studying the sum of the greatest summas of moral, scientific, and cultural relevance in the history of mankind that basically live forever up to this day, even for the one thing that is to say to understand what the whole world has been about concretely, right? To them, it stops to the fact, these were essentially evil doctrines that were used to oppress people. And when these people state that, you also know that they haven't studied history, because if they had studied history, and not only they would have understood that there is a civilizational purpose in having a certain belief, and in that history of religion that, by the way, is taught all over the West in all academies, and it is something that surely isn't based on blaming religion or demonizing it or rejecting it, but it's simply one of the great branches of of real culture that is really cultivated. People study these things because they are complex, because they are interesting, because they are deep. They have an insightful view of the world. There is an enormous interdisciplinarity that absolutely intertwines also with scientific thinking and education. Most people don't even know about this. They just assume that it's because they disliked it, or somebody imposed them religion when they were children, or because their families were disgusting independently from religion. They have to use that as a scapegoat, that is essentially burning books, because that is what it gets down to. And these people are even paid by the state to teach our children, right? So there is something incredibly wrong about this, that is wrong. This is what I would like to stress here. It's wrong from a scientifical point of view, right? Let's leave aside, of course, that these people are often scientistic. That is to say, they don't know what science is. They think science is just a box where they can store stuff. They find, I don't know, physics books, and saying that this is the truth, man. You have to stick to this, not to the Bible. It sucks. Science, again, is a method, right? And this has nothing to do, like, we get science from what we get that bucket, let's say, from the fact that we are cultivated individuals who are able to understand the world not just on the base of what happens in a laboratory, but if anything, and that's also an enormous scientific problem that has completely collapsed in the standards of Western education, of the fact that there is not even a debate on how you should use a laboratory datum in order to bring to a profitable application of the same to make the world prosper, right? So that's just a punchline. That's the next doctrine that is violently enforced by unconfident people that feel their moral weakness, their intellectual weakness, their ignorance, and they feel threatened by the world around, because of course if you're an ignorant, the world is hostile because you don't know what it is and you don't know how to cope it, and you're unavoidably being crushed by that if you are an adult with an unsatisfactory education. So let's kill somebody, right? That is to say, what happened in the past for the same reasons of bigotry and discrimination and, irrational motivations that, a person with a real scientific education should be provided with, and that, of course, these people really, really don't. And I'm finding literally the worst things happening under this point of view. I've met literally... okay, this generates into gender stuff, but it's not really, shouldn't be controversial. I mean, I was talking to a girl who basically, it's one of those countries that have difficult situation economically speaking, and she was still, I don't know what we were talking about, but fundamentally about the age of making children, which is a huge deal because mostly of work, of perspective, of career, and so on. So, incidentally, the girl from this conversation came from a country that, of course, is one of those that propagandated this mental illnesses about the world, the history as an obscure thing of the fact that it's all a man. And this was a counter, like this would be easily, I presume, a leftist, or at least some of these completely morally disoriented children that we are rising after the generations who have even completely forgotten about what was in that case the socialist past for real, etc. And that also from a country that has dramatic problems with labor force, because of course it wasn't a paradise before, and after socialism it was even worse, and because the imperialism has ended, and therefore they had to start working for real, that is to say what it works like for in the real world, not just doing nothing all the time in terms of productive activities and hoping that would work. Well, at this point, that country is naturally aging dramatically. Labor force is ever shorter because people do not make children, and they make it at an ever late age. And not only this girl basically had bailed out from her law studies. That in that country, by the way, are a joke like all formal education, but that's yet another problem. That they begin, children that I don't know at, they start university at 16 or 17 years old. That is to say, they still have to be formed, right? We don't have they don't even have had they haven't had enough years of mandatory education with appalling teaching, didactic standards in the first place, so that after 3 years, 4 years, all these people, I don't know, at 23 years old, they're doctors, right? They are lawyers, they're engineers at 23 years old. That is to say, where your prefrontal cortex hasn't still even, formed completely, and when in this sense you don't even know what you're doing fundamentally, and of course, they need that because they lack labor force, so they are obviously trying to also increase the age of the pension and all this stuff. And I said, you see, it's a demographic, because this girl was justifying essentially the fact that she had bailed out because she wanted to make, I don't know, art, right? That is to say, you studied all those years law. What do you want to do with art exactly? It is to say, if I had wanted to study art or whatever, I would have had to start from an early age, right, in a serious way, with a serious tertiary education, with lots of years of studies, right? These children now are believe that, if you just post things on Instagram or stuff, you're an artist or you're capable, you can have a future, right? What actually happened is that this girl basically bailed out from her studies. She even said, so many of my friends now are like this because they said, they're stuck in the studies or hard work they didn't like. Because, of course, working in that country is not very easy, and it's not even quite remunerative. There is a lot of corruption, all these things. But basically, the idea is I bail out from this. I reject it. I basically decide that, economic problems do not exist, that the world maybe will go on just because there are artists out there. And also, I want to do whatever I want, right? There is this complete rejection of the civilization that comes with properly self-sacrifice and discipline and commitment and spitting blood and sweating and tearing like crazy just to have something that is worth real value on the market, right? For saying I do whatever the fuck I want, right? Because I will live with the internet. And I said, well, what about children? And she said, well, not now, like in 10 years. The girl was, I think, like 24, something like that. So basically, at 34, that's when, I hope, no female audience will be offended with this, but, this is just a biological thing. Like by 34, the female body tends to decline quite rapidly in capacity, even, child making. I'll tell you, I don't know, my mother had me when she was 39, so I was kind of the proof that, of course, certain things are still possible, even beyond. But the question is that if you want to have that, and if you see it as a priority, right? If you see it as something that should be done, hopefully, in a functional way with some capacity and so on, you want to start having children exactly in the moment when you're getting really not good at it from a biological point of view. And she said, no, don't, because I don't know what she wanted to have fun. This is the usual thing, having fun and no control and who knows which ambitions, right? This person, I'm sure, by 34 will be, not necessarily bankrupt, but if you look at the demographic statistics of our country, that's the deal. Right, because literally there's going to be like tens of millions of labor force in shortage at that point. The economy is already not doing that well. The things are pretty strained from a political point of view. So I simply told her, but look, that there's a huge problem. Like if everybody reasoned like you at that point, the country will go severely bad. Right, there are already severe problems now. If there aren't enough people making children properly on a demographic base, it will be a disaster in labor force. And the thing is that I wasn't addressing that to her as if she had to make children herself, right? I was just commenting on the situation. And because, of course, the post-socialist paranoia was, of course, that nobody knows, somebody else's country's history or social or macroscopical socioeconomical data. Everybody would talk about your country as a sort of enemy that wants to to profit of you because of the terrible corrupt West that it wants always to seize the pure innocent good people that have never done anything. They have always sacrificed themselves for the good of the motherland. And this person actually was parading that in assessing that, this sounded as if there was a male control, like a patriarchy control on her reproductive organs, and that she should have sacrificed herself. She began being, because of course post-socialism is also about sarcasm. I don't give a damn much about that, meaning that she was cute. I mean, I didn't want to humiliate her or do anything like that, but that tells you immediately what's the idea today, that there is a mental and moral collapse, and also a moral, you see, because this person was basically saying something, if you know something about my country, then you should, because objectively I do, you should know that basically it's easier to die before you arrive to the age of pension, which is not true, of course, if you just know the rate, the employment rate, the normal age, life expectancy of that country, and what's the pension age and so on. So already you see what this was, a 24 years old, right? So almost, a complete adult, right, in from a mental point of view. And this person had to justify basically a complete bailout from discipline, fatigue, hard work, etc., by inventing fundamentally that who the fuck cares if labor force will literally collapse in 6 years and they will have essentially to emigrate en masse because they will simply not be able to make a living there. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because you're free, right? The interesting thing is, she said, it perplexed me a lot, is that I managed to bail out, and fortunately the world is getting freer. Right? At that point I didn't comment because I didn't want to start immediately just with the wrong foot, but the idea is the world is not getting freer at all, right? People like you and people like most people, unfortunately, are becoming ever less free because they are becoming ever poorer, ever properly from a moral and not just from a material point of view, and they don't even recognize that, and they don't even recognize that, of course, we are re-feudalizing in a certain sense, that already many people are somebody else's slaves fundamentally, and that it is not even completely somebody's fault in terms of those who make the rules, but it's mostly, as always, the fault of the same people. Right? Because at this point in history, just for the fact that you own a smartphone or a car or you have some bank account, you're capable of delivering such a powerful moral blow, if you really want to invest even a minimal part of that of those resources, that could make everything turn, right? And instead, it's your weakness that is fundamental, that is not motivated by any kind of terrible sufferance or disadvantage or injustice or whatever, that is making the thing done. And of course, if you find somebody that exploits that by making you convinced that there is some evil bad force that is preventing, that is de-empowering you, so that you can't basically do anything like an individual because you've already decided that you're giving up as one, you will just go into paranoia, into denial of reality, and into lots of other things that fundamentally will make you a real slave quite soon, and that will at that point justify, even partly from a moral point of view, that kind of exploitation. As long as in a free market you fundamentally simply give away your money with a by a certain degree bound moral standard. Of course, somebody should stand up for telling you at some point that we are all better off if you start being an intelligent person. So that's maybe not a justification, but at least you cannot complain whether that happens or not. What was that historically was so difficult? There was another good example. I came across. Yeah, but all at that point, you realize that how you would say how does history connect to this? Well, of course, if you don't know even what is happening in your own country at the moment, and you base your decisions just on what you ideally presume, of course you are declaring not to know anything about the state of your country. That person should have said, well, you're effectively right. That's exactly what is happening, with our economy, with demographic dynamics. Maybe I don't want to have children that soon, but that's right. That's a problem, and maybe even as a citizen should do something like that. What was the narrative? That somebody was essentially trying to push her to use her femininity to make children for the country, right? And a person who reasons like this is, I wouldn't say a traitor, or it's just a dumb person. And I'm sorry to say that, because again, I would like to talk with developed individuals, but it seems like that there is anything of that out there. And history is exactly this. Every time I get that a person doesn't quite know what history implies, because history implies fundamentally that you study broader political, military, and social issues at the end of the day. So these are by themselves already complex systems that should habituate you to the nuisances of method, of scientific problems of interpretation, of other matters that are that are not simply about what is your pregressed opinion on them, but faced with essentially with the reality of reality, and therefore that if you don't know really much about, you feel again threatened fundamentally by it. And there is a distrust. I would say in the last months I've evidenced, I presume, exactly this aspect, that is paranoia. That is, up to last year, as you know, I commented on these things and I imputed this mostly to certain ideologies, right? It could be ethno-nationalism. Yes, plenty of children out there. You see, as a European, I feel especially what is happening from the countries that we are integrating after the post-socialist era, right? Not that in the others we are so better in terms of, historical education, because we suck at it, but still we are better, right? And so we should even pose some kind of moral standards here. Here I will not digress on what's the economical policy of the EU and how we are dealing with the thing, but as you know, I'm a great promoter of the idea of a single European school, right? That maybe there is always a tension between, of course, you say, but it should be families who teach. Exactly, right? We should build a school that is not just about what a unitary vision of history is, because again, you cannot be a moral relativist, right? The idea of creating a single European school is fundamentally given an objective interpretation about things that happened, without presuming that you can reason, I don't know, just as a French, as a Romanian, as a Swede, as an Italian. You have to properly recreate the concept of Europe in its entirety, even beyond what are today's EU boundaries. I mean, of course, some countries are not even in. I include. Ideally, you would even include Russia into this, because in the, of course, it's not possible at this point, but the idea is that our Westernness is shared at some level that you can recognize, right? I don't see here boundaries that can. I mean, obviously, this should go on at the end of the day of being kind of a global thing. Right? It's just that with all the problems that we have, this is exactly the point. With all the distrust that we have towards authority today and narratives and what people call mainstream, that is really not existing, because things evolve all the time. They're very different, very contradictory in nature. There are many myths, right? And that's part of the paranoia, right? If you, for example, if you think there is a conspiracy theory of sort, right, that there is somebody that is, sometimes it is true. Sometimes there are, I think with the pandemic, there are certain things that are just so evident that, I'm okay with vaccines. I'm vaccinated. I have, properly an idea of what this thing should be coped with in a civic sense, right? But politically speaking, it is true that there is something that not just has gone wrong, but has been properly obscured. There's been properly and openly, hidden for the sake of diverging kind of the so-called public opinion from certain aspects. And of course, you always understand that there is a way to resist, a way to say, okay, we can't just passively accept something on that thing, but the idea should be that we're not just passive about it, but that we should be propositive about that as well. And I'm sorry as a conservative to say that conservatism is losing the battle, because I'm not sure it is really losing it, but it's because we haven't still started to fight, in a sense, meaning that of course it's on average easier for somebody who has this mindset, but the next step should be to take the thing at an ever larger scale, right? Otherwise, the concept can't be just have to be left alone. It can't be just pure libertarianism, as if that is literally from all the things you should just need. Because if somebody organizes in a way that wants to impose something on you, and you have no other chance at organizing in the same way back, right? And that requires a commitment. That requires essentially a coming together, a stepping forward, coming out on certain issues, and it can't be just wishful thinking, right? And history is one of those things. That is to say, how long are we going to, are we keeping to lose money for allowing people to tell historical bullshit just the way they want? right? I think a great part of you see, conservatives, generally speaking, were more interested in history than liberals, right? Because conservatism, of course, looks at something from the past to conserve, right? Whereas liberals tend to be, of course, more, okay, well, things change, who the hell cares, right? And these are two political, of course, directions, have all pros and cons, and all the from a conservative standpoint, the idea is that it seems we have given up properly the willingness even to accept a widespread education at good level as the prerogative of a conservative. Like conservatism, has always had an elite that was very highly educated, and that especially was educated in humanities. Right, today it seems to be the other way around. It is to say it was humanities and scientific thing, but all together today, this is especially from an American perspective, the idea is that humanities are, and in part it is true absolutely, that are monopolized by the left. But this has nothing to do with the fact that you should be educated humanistically, right? That there is no real intellectual or identity or moral or cultural pride in saying, I should just focus, on so-called scientific subjects, and humanities are not good because just it's the market. You cannot have, a moral system that is based just on the market, right? Because it is unavoidably going to be such short term that will backfire in terms of your capacity to think in a broader term, in a broader strategy. The market doesn't quite do it because, of course, it's mostly the sum of all these activities. So there is much more chaos and confusion. Of course, while the economy is based on it, at the same time, there is a competition that should be based on the bet, say, on something in the future that is reasoning longer term, so that you can, at the end of the day, obtain something more solid if you have a real vision and if you have a real capacity to think that big for something that you see in the future is going to work, right? History, in a sense, provides for a very good field of investment, because history is never going to be twisted as such, right? The myth that history changes because historical perspectives change is yet another mistake. That is to say, yes, it is true, but it's not that history at this point can be completely changed, right? There can be other teams that come on the fore, for sure there are other perspectives, but this is the point that many miss, that history is based on real evidence, and that until you find some overwhelming unknown evidence, history cannot change per se, right? That is, we can't hardly change the past. We can't in terms of what happened, first of all, but the evidence we have points to a very defined direction, right? It's not really, how I could say, it's not that since we have a few evidence, about a certain period in history, this means that there is, who knows what that we haven't still figured out, when we see that certain macroscopical indicators about that reality point to that, right? I was asked recently, but how do we know that history is true, right? And that is, that a work wasn't, that we have just through medieval manuscript tradition, wasn't written in the Middle Ages and not in the ancient world. Well, because we know what the ancient world was, because there is an overwhelming archaeological evidence that matches essentially with the, with all we know what eventually was preserved later, and maybe comes up from a later tradition we cannot trace in the, in the intermediate time. We know it because linguistically we see that there is an evolution that corresponds to that. We know that in medieval times, they couldn't write classical Greek as they wrote in the ancient time. They didn't have properly intellectual tools to fabricate that. We know it because the internal data of the work make a logical sense on the basis of what we already know about all the other data that we have from that time at the same time. So you cannot, you see, this is the beauty of reality. This is the beauty of evidence. This is the beauty of, that you can slap in somebody's face to say, I don't care what you want to tear down for your own lunacy and hatred towards your own self for your own individual failure. history is here in front of our eyes, and it doesn't give a damn about how you feel about it, but it just gives a damn on how to interpret it from a scientific point of view. And so this distrust towards history, unfortunately, it's a thing, conservatively speaking, because it is true that humanities have been monopolized very often by the left. I come from a country where this is being true, but it hasn't been brought to the extreme consequences like it's happening, for example, largely in the United States, that have a serious problem with this, and that is kind of, I hope, is not, it has already spread actually in some European countries at some important level, and that in my own, that is slightly more traditional in nature, but probably has a different approach to both scientific and humanistic subjects for our history, because we're definitely a peculiar country, especially in the relation with the past, right? And especially on a longer term. But the concept in this sense is you cannot give up, first of all, the fight over education. You cannot abandon it to cultural Marxism and other appalling abominations of the dignity of human civilization. You cannot pretend that the subjects themselves have anything to do with that, right? This argument would be like, since it's the same argument that the theophobic people do with saying, religion sucks because just they were imposed it, right? This has nothing to do with religion itself. It has to do, if you study religion, you simply become an intelligent person, because it's a very complex system that you have to frame from a philosophical, theological, linguistical, historical, anthropological point of view. That makes you automatically a better person, but they don't know. So the same is happening, sadly enough, in conservatism, in the fact that in this regard, we have to accept it, that if roughly half of the population is conservative and the other is liberal, of course this half of the population by standards is not elite, right? It's part of the same scum we were talking about at the beginning. So it's obvious that to them it's not evident that history is something meaningful and important, and literally one of the most powerful weapons to struggle against ignorance and ideologism. And the beauty of this is that if you play by scientific measure, when you study history as any other thing, you destroy ideologism. That is to say, history is not, this is the point. As you believe that there is a truth out there, and that it's surely difficult, it's surely out of reach of our poor cognitive means, but still, the more you understand reality, the closer you get to it, and the broader view you get of it. So it is history, because history is just sorting out that reality and showing that hierarchy, that order, that authority, that discipline. And the reason why arguments like they are so populistic and racistic and in nature, and and in fact they are mostly socialistically oriented, based on this kind of a nullification of the individual, obviously derive from the fact that individuals have already nullified themselves. So it's obvious that they prevail. But this doesn't erase history. It just proves how far these people are from understanding history. That is to say, history always remained there, because what happened in the past has happened. So you cannot hope to twist it just because you have a subjective opinion on it. That thing will always remain the way it is, and the more you study it for real, and the more it will be difficult to change that, right? And what we know about history, and the way we have taught it, even with all the problems, but historiography in general, has made a very good work. It has refined over time, right? Because after all, it's been done by the elite, because it's always an elite that's been doing that. But this is being surrendered to other things that had nothing to do with it. You know that at that point, it's not even much about being left or right. It's about properly not having a satisfactory education anymore. And I'm seeing it because, I don't know, you think that I'm a medievalist. You think that, I don't know, that European medievalists, like PhDs, actually, I don't know, can translate Latin anymore? Do you think I don't know, you go to the UK or Germany, and people actually, medievalists, so people who should know Latin forcefully without any kind of excuse, are able to translate Latin. If you do think so, you're joking. Yeah, you're delusional, and that's the level of complete moral decay that we have achieved, and this rests on the individuals, right? And that's why it's easier to say, okay, no, it's not. It's better to identify just with a larger group by itself. No, it has to do with how strong you are individually, and this is true in every field. Hell, even in military. So the point of history is not, if you distrust history, it means that you essentially distrust anything. As far as we are concerned, you distrust science, you distrust religion as well. You distrust basically any kind of complex capacity that is the one that our civilization has built over the millennia, and that has gone more far than any other in the world, and that it is already prepared, pre-packed, perfectly functional and cogent and sensible and scientific and rational and positively applicable tool that you decide simply to throw away, to revert to misery, to revert to barbarism, to revert to the denial of beauty, of love, of life, of differences between, I don't know, men and women, or of what this represent from a civilizational point of view. This has nothing to do with accepting the fact that there are certain realities, because in the world they had already been spotted, and they had not even been banned or removed or oppressed. This is just the narrative that you're being fed with nowadays. So that by repeating that lie, you're even keeping to believe it yourself, right? So it's really difficult sometimes to even start to make a point about this, because it feels always as if you were too harsh by stating this, but it's at the same time a bit like what we all think, in that we have no courage to state out loud. I think that I will be more vocal about these things. I don't plan to make any, these are just videos that I make, as you know, in this Tyranny playlist, where I make all the channel updates and whatever is not just the usual historical talk. But this is historical. This is perhaps more historical than all the other stories I tell in the rest of the videos that you watch, right? And that may be antipathetic. I don't know. I know that there are, for example, a lot of leftists who follow my channel, right? As much as I know that there are many alt-righters that follow my channel, so I think the spectrum here is completely, represented. And I obviously lean, as you understand, since an early time on Schwerpunkt towards more the right side. But at the same time, you know that you have been following me because I don't make a point like that in when I talk. When I make history on the videos. That is to say, if things went in a certain way historically, I have no point, no interest in distorting that reality. And my point is that there must be I'm more to that side. Because I see that what is happening today is the shift towards another balance. This is not, in fact, just about left and right. There is a qualitative difference in properly the idea of how much authority you want, right? Let's be honest. People do not quite like authority by themselves. I mean, they're able to give authority to others, to crush others, but they're not able to use authority anymore. I think even for the fact that I talk about strategy, that I've started the Fun Closet series that we'll have to handle at some point now. There's this moment of re-uploading that has cut a bit the routine, but that will hopefully be completed. And there is a sense of empowerment that starts from having a seigneury on your own self, right? And from that you can move on to the one of the world, right? And these are always risky topics, right? I personally, I don't know, I hadn't understood so much how, the reason why, for example, leftism, Marxism spread, and structuralism as such, in Western universities until I haven't read Mein Kampf, which is a terrible book, by the way, literally from a literary point of view. I mean, it sucks. If I wanted to read something, from racism, I would read the Gobineau or something else. That's eye-opening because it makes you realize that the idealistic part which that we lack so much today, of course, has been banned, has been erased, because it is what had fueled such movements, even like National Socialism, but not only, right? And that, however, have to exist in a balanced society. I'm not for example, eliminating, like, I will read Hitler as much as I will read Marx, even though they're two completely different things, properly on a, not much just on a political level, properly from an historical and properly a literary point of view. There's nothing hardly. There is something about that, of course, they have in common, but it's importantly so. But we need both, right? You cannot we must restart from history, because we cannot be honest about the past coming from democracies that still banned books up to a few years ago, right? Because of a certain past. We cannot build a civilization if we still, if there is a whole branch of us that still lacks the most elementary tools of such civilizational capacity. We cannot fix from a day to another, I don't know, the fact that certain countries lived for centuries in appalling conditions of misery. They went through eventually this educational totalitarianism, etc., and then all of a sudden, just 30 years ago, came out, and it's as if that background did not exist. We have to find the problems here. We're talking about serious ones, because together with this ignorance comes literally, lack of democratic culture, lack of civic education, lack of respect, towards women, right? There is you say, or towards men for that matter, because this is the point, right? We are forgetting what civilizational's role are, because if we don't educate people about those, of course we will hardly see how these things properly matter in the first place, right? If everything is collapsing, of course, trying to save one thing rather than another seems strange. Here we have to think about a formula that reevaluates what the human intelligence can base itself upon to improve itself, right? And at some point there's been simple pressures, been simply the hardships of life that finally make us break free from conditions of misery up to a few generations ago, and now we're stopping, and without that pressure we lose that applicational capability. And that's why we are becoming so relativistic. It's not because it's a next stage of civilization. It's simply a next stage in our history that is actually a regression in civilization. So if you maybe this video, I don't know how, I don't know by listening it all together how much it makes sense. But I intend in the future to explain better why history provides you with such capacity to fix the problem. Because it's not a matter of emulating the past. It's a matter of realizing what normally happens in general to human communities, right? As a broader dynamic, not because you can't foretell or reinterpret simply on the basis of the past what is happening today. But because you have much clearer in mind what human nature fundamentally is about, right? And this has not quite changed, and that's why, for example, thinking that there is a radical change that is unhinged from what happened before is a scientific denial, because there are certain universal dimensions that quite never get old, are never quite fundamentally ruled out from our culture. Do you think that, I don't know, wokeism, for example, is anything new? It's something that it has some cultural features that are new because it's part of today's context, but this is no different from the usual essentially Gnosticism that always reappeared every once in a while in history for some moment, especially in some moments of great expansion of, in fact, the middle classes that eventually go in crisis once again, and that eventually gets taken out, fortunately, by orthodoxy, because that's the destiny of these movements. But the damage that can be produced, there is nothing deterministic about that, because the dangers it can produce concretely, and especially in this unprecedented level of development, are enormous, right? In mass community, statalism, nationalism have produced things like World War I, World War II, the totalitarianisms. They are the direct consequences of it, not much because of the ideology in itself. I mean, the nation state had to be born in a way or another, because it's just a stage of a civilizational development. It's just that we have to know how to handle that, right? In part, it's fluidifying. I mean, national statalism is, at this point, you can't argue really at its end, because the formula is still valid, because still we have certain means of centralizations and coercion that make it. It's just that the boundaries are opening once again on a broader base, and especially at a global level. So that's yet another, a much broader scale. So if you're scared of the fact that we have had 2 world wars, that we have had communism, that we have had Nazi fascism, we have had the Holocaust, and all these, and the many other tragedies that we're all aware of literally hundreds of millions of people simply wiped out, not even because of a specific evil most of the times, but first of all, of sheer incompetence, right? Of literally people who didn't know how to manage a country, right? This is especially evident in communism, that is surely, in this sense, in terms of body count, the unavoidable worst. This doesn't mean that Nazi fascism, for example, wasn't morally, more wicked in nature, but in a way or in another, if that scale scares you, just think that the dimensions that we are essentially approaching today by scale are so wider than that you don't really want to know what would happen if we lost control on our civilizational capacity, right? We have been living too much in the dream. It's like Fukuyama's delusion. It's properly the idea, the end of history illusion. That is the idea that our West would have triumphed anyway, right? At the end of the Soviet Union, and so on. Instead, it wouldn't happen, right? Why? Because there is any specific evil. What was the next bad guy? The next bad guy is ourselves. It's recognizing that there can't be an hypocritical, puritanic delusion of the fact that we are always the good ones, and as Westerners, we're surely the best. That's the thing you should always remember, that you can be bad, but still better than others. And this is always the double thread that history teaches you. It's like before. Like it's like saying those people that reject all history, and they throw away all the substance and the reality with it altogether. The bad guy is always the next guy as much as yourself, and the only one that can fix the thing is yourself, right? Because if the West collapses, there's truly no other point of reference, civilizationally speaking. I mean, we can see other civilizations grow, but these are things that haven't had the same effective synthesis of moral and scientific value that the West has, in fact, fortunately, overly exported all over these places in the world by itself, right? As a Clausewitzian and as a fierce anti-communist, as much anti-fascist or Nazis. Still, everybody knows that the ones who best topped the Clausewitzian theory were the communists, right? And that's part of the reason why, in fact, that I don't know, as we were saying before, the Germans screwed up both the First and Second World War. Is that they believed they were acting upon von Clausewitz. They were actually completely misunderstanding it at the very root, and that was coming from the very top of their own German civilization that they had, however, forgotten, because mass culture had done that as well, which is kind of ironic, given that von Clausewitz was also warning about this thing, because he had found himself to develop in spite of it, and had rendered possible the same German unification, but paradoxically, war's forces took over because of, at the end of the day, of this kind of mismatch of incapacity, unqualification, and essentially forgetting of the same Clausewitzian principles. And we could go on relatively to this topic, but I especially care about the fact that you don't buy into moral relativism in this regard, that you don't think that history can be history could be your compass, right? It could be truly your moral compass. For years, I thought that the idea of Historia Magistra Vitae was a bit of an overstatement, meaning that, of course, you cannot quite use history to be told, what you have to do, like a manual, right? But that was because I was making myself the mistake of considering history as such thing, right? As a story, and not as the activity, the method, the science that it factually is, right? And when you understand that requires a discipline to attain. And if there is no such discipline, if you don't even start to make people realize that, or enforcing them to apply in that sense, you will never get anywhere. So this to me is particularly important because it's fundamentally all what my life is revolving around in a way or another, right? It's almost embarrassing how many private questions, especially in the last year, and this has been increasing, have fundamentally, even escaped my control, because I've began to be invested by such ideas. That is to say, you have to be prepared. You have to be in control of it. You have to make up your mind. It makes you grow in ways that you wish you hadn't had to find out in such a hard way, but that at the same time make you ever more worried and concerned about what the world is going to become in a way or another. And it may be it's uncomfortable, right? That's why people tend to escape that, because again, it's unsettling. It's really a challenge for yourself. It requires hard work and commitment, and you don't even know where it's bringing you to, because when you start aging, you feel, but after all, I don't have so much more to live in general. Like, where is this going? Like, at some point I will be dead, and how much of what I would like to see will be achieved, right? But at least I can be vocal about that. I can leave this for somebody else to reflect on. I don't know whether YouTube will exist. I don't know in how much time. Whether people will be interested in such talks from the past at some point. I hope so, right? I am an optimist after all. I think that the gates of hell shall not prevail, right? I believe this. It's my fate. It's my culture. It's my civilization. It's my values. I know that evil will not prevail, right? But I know that things will go worse before they get better, because this is also how it's supposed to be. That there is something insanely dark in human existence that needs to happen in order to bring to salvation. So this is not anecdotal. This is not contingent. This is meant to be, right? And we all know that it was meant to be. It's just we wouldn't listen. We wouldn't listen to our own wisdom, to our own science, to our own reality, right? And the moment in which we contract and turn away and disown properly such base, we are done for, right? That is to say, of course, civilization will doesn't have a standard pack of elements that, let's say, come from just this or that place. History changes, people change, culture change, but there is something that is not alterable, right? So that when I talk about the West, I'm talking about a way to stick to that inalterable, right? And not because the inalterable means to stick to a dogma that you can't fundamentally even discuss, but because you have to understand what that is, right? And how to get there. It's a method, it's a process, right? It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of commitment. But if this commitment doesn't exist anymore because everything becomes too easy, we cannot, again, educate ourselves about it. So it may seem like a lost hope. It may seem a moment in history when we are becoming counter-cultural ourselves because we are the minority and because we maybe we've always been, but at this point it almost takes a kind of ascetic dimension because it's like withdrawing from the world, right? This already happened historically. There were certain moments in which simply the people didn't accept this and they decided that it was a higher value and that therefore they had to pioneer it in some other places, right? There is a there is a sense of this, but in this sense, never underestimate what you can draw from history. Never underestimate the power, the wealth, the authority, the discipline, all the possible, the best resources you can find for building the next world. In so much abundance, if you just put yourself to the test, if you just accept that you have to fight to the end, right? Usque ad finem et ultra, because without that, it's not even worth living anymore, right? What do you prefer, right? It's just to be the other great cultural delusion that we are fed, and I see, in fact, most people I encounter is, what do you want to be in life? I say, I want to be happy. This is probably the worst answer you can ever give. Because to them, it's just, okay, you want just to be miserable, okay, you're sad, whatever. They don't understand that by saying what you want to be happy, you are probably the most miserable person. In many ways. First of all, because you are already, you wish you were happy and evidently you aren't. Right. Secondly, because you don't understand that normally happiness is not a permanent state by definition, even when things happen, and that this really depends on also, it's also relative in nature. Third, because, and this is the most important thing, it's because you fundamentally don't know how, like, what to do of your life. What you think is the lack of happiness is fundamentally a lack of power, is a lack of tools, it's a lack of capacity to achieve. The object of life, what you should strive for, is achieving things in life. Because without that, you cannot grow into a better person and therefore handle life not to be permanently happy, which is an utopia, a delusion, a nonsensical psychiatric state. Like it's not, humans are not meant biologically to be happy all times. It doesn't make any sense. There must be a specific reason that is transient, and that there's not such a constantly happy state. Doesn't mean anything. You have to make the world work in order to be satisfied with what you have. And in the best way you can be satisfied, which will never be enough, but that is still the reason for which you can do better, is to of course achieve, to obtain something, to make a work, to write, to struggle, to make, really, to see, to build up what you wanna have, what you wanna do, what you wanna be, and that grows, by the way, together with your own personal responsibility. That is, it never ends there. It's like always a constant test, a refinement, that in the process of which you become ever more powerful, and therefore capable of striking, capable of achieving your results, and managing, and also bringing things forward for you, for the people you love, for the world, and then living essentially of that specific sap, right? That is the action. In a way, it's pure action that we should strive for, and in pure action stands pure magic, and what we would see as the truth, as in a way the unattainable, but still something you can grow closer to. And this is what we are forgetting, right? The people bail out of their work and say, okay, no, I simply don't like this work, so I don't want to do anything. I will arrange myself in some way or another, like I will, just use scraps or, whatever, but just I don't want to do their life. Those are people who have already given up their own life, their own soul, their own responsibility, and not only will never be happy, but they will pay for it. That is to say, it doesn't end at the moment. It ends it doesn't end even. It will go beyond even their death, because the lack of order, the lack of resources, the lack of morality that they have caused will have to be compensated by others, right? And they themselves will surely lack it during their lifetime. They will be obliged to face a much harsher reality the longer they go on, so that there will be a point in which they will never even be able to go back and say, I wish I hadn't chosen that, because you will be overwhelmed by it. And so they will remain exactly when they have stopped. So that you, as far as I can see, you meet all these what could have been otherwise bright women with a lot of a lot of hopes, a lot of good intentions, etc. That at the end of the day, they arrive at the moment even when they can't even have more anymore. Can't have children. They have maybe they have had it, and their marriages have failed, and they don't even have a decent job, and they don't know what to do, and they suffer of it and become ever more. As if the same goes for men. Right, men also make it even less in insight, and those are even the most pathetic, because it's not even about what are you up to. Like, you should be properly the one who leads. You are the one who should provide that capacity and that strength and that confidence and authority. Men are shrinking into miserable, coward weaklings without any kind of backbone, without any kind of dignity and self-control and discipline and respect and intelligence. I don't know what the world will come at this point. I don't think there is nothing to be proud of such being such ways. I think that pride can stem, generally speaking, from a person who achieves something in their lives. All the others are just fundamentally whining about the fact that they're complete losers. They know it perfectly well, and therefore invent this delusional ideology for the fact that they breathe and they exist. They demand, they impose, they steal. Things like respect or dignity, etc., becoming fundamentally ridiculous at the point of being consumed to the end of their time in their own moral and even material misery. And I reject this. I don't think these people. You see, there is one harsh aspect. This is that, of course, we should be able to save ourselves collectively. And in the last times, I understood how true this is, right? Is that how much can the help of a person make another person better? And I think I make my part, right? I'm not saying that these videos maybe are part of it. Maybe, who knows? If somebody reasons through these, or listen to something new, maybe. But at the same time, I believe that that's partly because the reason why I'm a conservative, because it turns out there is something, it's a bit too deterministic and scientific in itself, but there's also something biological in this, right? Conservatives tend to be more, generally speaking, more, less tolerant, let's say less tolerant, more more, say, colder and more authoritative and more disciplinary individuals, right? I've always been, at some levels, even viciously cruel, and heartless and completely cold towards these kind of weakness. That is to say, if you are weak, you essentially deserve it. And I hope that what I say at least is a way of helping such people in the same way, especially males, I would say, because women have a lot of qualities. Of course, as a man, I cannot put here on the fore, and so I'm the moment in which I talk about von Clausewitz, I explain the von Kriege, and I talk about military history. I'm trying to provide there exactly that kind of model of healthy aggressiveness, of healthy violence, of healthy authority that doesn't degenerate into oppression, into real evil, and in fact, totalitarianism and all things like these, that is needed biologically in order to know how to command, in order how to lead, in order how to guide, in order how to see clearly, and how to have a point of reference, right? And what I'm astonished by is that ever more I've grown like this, and that even at the beginning of Schwerpunkt I wasn't like this. I have grown terrifically ever since I started making these videos, even as an individual, in part also for the channel itself, in part also for things that happened to me in the meanwhile, of course, things I achieved, people I've met, and all these stuff, but that, in my opinion, are what leadership should be about. What we teach strategic culture for if we're not really interested in such political capacity. It is where we should take the reins of our own existence and the reins of the world, right? When we study those knights in the High Middle Ages, we're literally building another world with all the cruel means that they were capable of, but still with an intelligence and an insight and a logic and a rationale that we have deeply, forgotten and buried and confused and misrepresented. Those people were emerging from a world that had no rules, that had no justice, that had misery, and it had lost hope, in a sense, that were capable of giving a new shape to that, right? With the great things that have, catalyzed the phenomenon, the growth of urbanism, of the great cathedrals, of the splendid celestial art, of the recovery of a rational scientific mentality such as the one of the Aristotelian, one of the Scholastic, the beauty of the woman, the dignity of the woman, the respect, the love toward the woman, think about the recovery of the Virgin in art throughout all the low Middle Ages, and this beautiful representation. What is there something more beautiful than seeing a mother with her child? Like, you tell me. To me, that's, in my opinion, the single most beautiful thing. It's what you would really like to die for in the name of civilization. A mother with her child, right? And we have the task, the duty to provide that mother and that child with a husband, with a father, and to provide with a leadership that has to make this world just, real just, not anything like objectively just, because there is no such thing as justice if it becomes, social justice or moral, whatever. Justice is only one. It's as one as the truth, and we need to impose that. We need to give ourselves discipline. We have to learn to obey, and then to learn how to command. And I believe that talking about military history is crucial, is fundamental, because without that there can't be any of this. And when you crash into people's soft weakness, and these people are horrified because they don't even understand what you're talking about, and they think that you're just an imposer or a tyrant or a fascist or whatever, you know that you're doing the right thing. You know that you're providing these people with, you're showing them the might of strategic culture. You're showing them the power of discipline. You're providing them with the justice of authority. And these are things that are being forgotten. And if you want to take that banner, I'm with you, right? We have to do this together. right? Because together we are stronger. There is not a military culture that is superior in individualism, right? And individualism, in that sense, is a declaration of military inferiority. And so this, that there can be, of course, a leader in the elite sense of it, because the mind, of course, is the one that leads, is the moral force, right? There must be a unity of command. But this cannot exist if there is not the same level of, at least of virtue, not necessarily of intelligence, but of virtue, and in across the filing ranks, right? Because without that, there can't be a cohesive army, there can't be a disciplined force, you can't use your military instrument. And this is instead what we're teaching, what we really want the world to know. So this thing goes far beyond any kind of egoism, of individualistic, in fact, properly nihilism, right? Of lack of any kind of fixed moral value or respect for the humanity in its scientific and moral dimension. This is a kind of a heavy statement as such, but as such, I think the channel should progress, right? This is not an entertainment channel. It's never been. You know how heavy this content can get, especially when I talk so much. But at the same time, this has a meaning, and that's the reason why you follow Schwerpunkt for all this time. And the more we grow, and we're growing more slowly now just because of technical reasons, but the things are going to improve quite soon. And at that point, we really have a chance to do something more than just a YouTube channel. We can expand into something more, right? And to provide with a point of reference that I think history can, in itself, can provide. So for now, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.